Okay, welcome everyone back. So our next speaker this morning is Laurent Woody Van Arkel. Woody, along with his wife Catherine, have been farming near Dresden, Ontario for 35 years after taking over the family farm from his parents. He has grown a variety of crops typical of the Dresden area, including corn, soybeans, wheat, processing tomatoes, sunflowers, and sugar beets. Interested in expanding their crop rotation, they grew their first crop of sunflowers in 2020. His interest in soil sustainability has led to their use of and experimentation with crops and reduced tillage, along with partnerships with the University of Guelph, OMFRA, the AAFC Living Labs Initiative, and it also led him to co-found the Ontario Soil Network and is now chair of its board of directors. Woody was the past director and past president of the Innovative Farmers Association of Ontario and is a farmer representative of the Midwest Cover Crop Council.
Kind of odd doing this remotely. I much more enjoy the one-on-one interactions you get at a conference, but flipping a plane over on a runway kind of plays havoc with flights around, so I couldn't get there. Like my introduction said, I farm just outside of Dresden, growing corn, soybeans, wheat, sugar beets, sunflowers, and I have a hog finishing operation. As of 3 weeks ago, I was a sugar beet farmer. I just sold my shares in the company and I'm retiring from the sugar beet part of the business, but I'm still going to talk about it. I farm down here in Southern Ontario in old glacial lake beds. So it's clay loam to sand loam, sometimes within 100 feet of each other, very poorly drained, everything's systematically tiled. And I put the map up so you guys have a context of where I farm. So what I do probably isn't going to translate directly, but what I hope is that you can take bits and pieces of what I talk about and maybe implement that on your farms. I spent a lot of time in conferences in the Midwest US doing the same thing. It was a series of little bits and pieces that got me to where I am today. The other thing was this, I call it my light bulb moment. It happened, I used to say I can remember saying 35 years ago, but now it's probably 45 years ago. I was moldboard plowing for my dad right behind the house where I live. And we were bringing up last year's corn stalks. They were coming up black and charred. And I stopped plowing and my dad and I looked at it, and some of it was the fact that we just had a crappy plow. It didn't do a nice job. But we just looked at that and we knew we were doing something wrong. We knew we had to change. We had no idea what we were looking at or what was going on, but we just knew it wasn't right. And that led to parking the plow shortly after that and going to a chisel plow or a mulch till type system. The other thing we had was wind erosion on our sandy loam knolls. And so that also addressed that. 25 years ago or so, I introduced no-till and soybeans and wheat onto the farm. And started to play with rudimentary cover crops, very basic level. 16 years ago, I did my first strip till crop of sugar beets, and now strip till for corn and sugar beets. Over these years, I've kind of developed a series of goals that I filter my decisions when I decide to do something or change something on the farm. I kind of put them through these 3 or 4 goals. I want to keep my soil covered as much as possible. That's either cover crops or crop residue. I want to do as little tillage as possible. As you can see in the picture there, when I grow sugar beets, there is some soil disturbance just in the fact of harvesting. So what I usually do in a situation like that is I will spread a cover crop cereal rye at this point and level the field and still seed bed that in the spring. So it's not a pure no-till or pure I do not till. A little bit does happen and needs to happen. And I'm trying to keep a living root system growing in the soil 365 days a year, whether that's a crop or a cover crop. And that's still a bit of a working process, but that's what I'm working towards. And having said all that, it still needs to make economic sense. I could do wonderful things to save my soil and create a perfect environment to create organic matter or what have you, but if it doesn't make me any profit, or if it's costing me too much money, then it doesn't make sense either. Like was mentioned in the introduction, I do a fair bit of on-farm research. I do a lot of strip trials of different practices, fertilizer trials, manure fertilizer trials. But I've been involved with two larger projects. The first one being a cover crop manure trial with the University of Guelph and Cameron Ogilvy. We tried to see if we could pick out the advantage of spreading manure after winter wheat, seeding a cover crop, and seeing what that brought to the following crop as following corn crop. And we did it with a series of different cover crop blends with and without side dress nitrogen. What we found out was corn didn't like cereal rye, and we created a lot more questions than answers, but it was a fun experiment. The second big one is the perennial cover crop and row crop system I've been working on, and AAFC and their Living Labs program has incorporated that 4 years ago. Yeah, 4 years ago, I think now, to put a couple of researchers on the farm and have them test the system. I'm going to get into a little bit more of that later. Like I said, I no-till my soybeans, sunflowers, winter wheat. That's been standard practice for quite a while. One of the things I really realized early when I introduced strip till onto the farm was that I have this managed system where I know I'm going to plant in the spring. Why can't I put cover crops in between that? So shortly after introducing strip till, I started to work as much as possible with keeping a overwintering cover crop growing between my strips. I really like how that works. It doesn't interfere that much with the planting system in the spring. I'm not confined by weather and having the cover crop get too big or anything. I still have my strip that I can work with. I can terminate ahead of planting. I can terminate at planting. I can even terminate after planting. I just prefer to have it start to look like this before things start to emerge. It also helps with wheel traffic and wheel carryability in the spring. I have played a little bit, or I've played a fair bit with plant green. I did a little bit with corn, and like I said in the research session there earlier, corn and cereal rye don't like each other. There's some antagonism there. So I don't do that anymore, but I still will plant green soybeans, especially after sugar beets where I've got the cover crop seeded and level and ready to plant in the spring. It does come with benefits. It's excellent for moisture retention, or really helps. The bottom picture here is only a few feet from each other. One is no-tilled into corn stalks, one is underneath that mat of cereal rye. The moisture difference is night and day. It's also really good at weed suppression when you have a mat like that. I was awfully tempted not to use a residual herbicide on that little strip. I ended up doing it, but I should have left the strip just to see what weed control would have been like. And that residue mat will be there into the next spring, so excellent ground cover. Having said that, it does come with its challenges. Planting cereal rye too thick, getting too thick a mat, as it does do really well for weed suppression, did cost me 7 bushels of beans and about 7 days in maturity. So when I do plant green, I aim for thinner is better than too thick. That was just a bit of a screw up. I forgot to set the drill back. I was trying to beat a rain that was coming in, and ended up seeding about 100 pounds an acre in September, where normally I would seed about 30. It can cause some difficulty. Let's back up. So the next time I had too thick a stand, I thought, well, I'm not rolling it flat. It cost me yield. I left it standing, and that's down here. It planted really well. It was probably July before the neighbors knew there was a soybean field there. I got a few questions of what I was going to do with that straw. It was the second best yielding crop of soybeans we harvested that year, but that standing straw did not want to go through the combine, or did not want to go through the knife. Probably the knife was getting a little worn. It just stayed wet and tough down in there, and it was a real challenge to harvest. It also shaded my herbicide, or created a shade effect of getting herbicides to the ground. And I don't see any in there. I think there's one right there, but Canada fleabane, I'm not sure if that's an issue in PEI yet. It came through there really well because there were spots with open soil and no herbicide. So now I want to make sure my cover crop is close to the ground, maybe not flat, but at least close to the ground so that I can get a decent herbicide application. Timing of roller crimping, there's 2 things there. One is I will plant and then roller crimp because I don't want to have the roller going the opposite direction of the planter. That doesn't flow really nice. It's kind of like trying to pet a cat backwards. That just doesn't work well. And terminating rye is a little bit of an art in a sense. If you think it's going to be dry and it's starting to go into boot or push heads, you may want to terminate early. If it looks like there's a rain event and you terminate ahead of planting, then it doesn't dry out under there, and then you're fighting that residue for 3 weeks. So then in that case, I'd rather terminate after planting. Like I said at the beginning, I do have a hog operation, a hog finishing barn, and which means I have manure. When I first started in the hog business, I live about 1.5 miles south of the town of Dresden, and blowing manure on top on the August long weekend didn't make me the nicest guy in town. So I started injecting manure using a big C-shank injector, which was excellent for getting the manure below ground and reducing odors, but was a challenge in trying to get it leveled out. Now to 1 or 2 field cultivator passes, I lost all my moisture in the summer for trying to get a cover crop established. Became a challenge. So this is version 1.0. Those are Flexicoil, no-till, single disc seed openers. I started with the wheels on, that just plugged up, so I was in the process of taking the wheels off there. And what it does, or did, was cut 2 to 4 inch deep slots in the ground, depending on soil moisture, and gave the manure a place to seep below ground level. It worked well for reducing odor, not as well as the injectors, but greatly reduced it. The problem with that was the disc openers were not robust enough to stand up to applications like that. It also limited my speed, so I was putting on a little more manure than I wanted to see go down. So version 2.0 is a series of nose coulters off a planter, wavy coulters that run about 2 to 3 inches deep and give a little bit of loose soil for that manure to soak into. What I like about this system is that after a couple of days, I can just follow it with the drill, plant a cover crop, get something growing so that there's taking up that fertility that manure has, because I don't want to see it leaving the farm. I forgot to mention at the beginning that I'm on a municipal water system and my water comes from Lake Erie. And I'm sure you're familiar with the Toledo algae bloom that shut their water system down. So my goal is not to add to that problem and potentially shut my water system down. So I started, this is usually after manure was usually a multi-species cover crop. I started with the theory of more is better. I was 12, 14 waste species blends. I have since backed off that big blend and have a blend of about 4 or 5 species based around oats because I know what they're going to do. But the advantage to having multi-species is you have a diversity in seed size. So depending on the summer conditions, whether it's dry or wet or cool or hot, some will germinate with less moisture, some will push with cooler soil temperatures. You never had the same looking field twice. You always had a stand. So it helped cope with that weather diversity. It also, going into the fall, if you had a warmer fall, certain things would grow really tall, like the bottom picture, trying to strip till through 12-foot tall sorghum Sudan grass. It never had the same outcome depending on weather. It also created a pollinator habitat. I always had sunflowers as part of the blend, and probably still would be part of my blend if I wasn't using them as a production crop. There's things like peas, buckwheat. In that top picture, I see some oilseed radish that has decided to bolt and flower, which creates the potential for seed production. In the case I know some are worried about buckwheat being a weed issue in the following year. My concern was the oilseed radish that was pushing seed in a sugar beet rotation. They're fairly closely related, and I didn't want to be fighting that as a weed, so I ended up terminating that cover crop early just to stop seed production. In an attempt to have cover crops established after corn, I played around for a number of years interseeding cover crops, but it had its challenges. One was it really limited my residual herbicide program. You had to be really careful of what you put down in your corn because you're trying to establish another crop. There's a very limited number of species that will do well in the shade of a really good corn crop. and timing of planting it, so trying to get it established before the corn got too tall so that it was well rooted and had some leaves and weaned off the seed nutrition before it shaded in was important. The other thing is if it didn't rain in June or July, the corn would win and the cover crop would run out of water. And the other last one of the best species that I found that would work interseeding was annual ryegrass, which was very tolerant to a lot of corn herbicides and apparently is very good at building resistance to some of those herbicides. So I stopped using it because I didn't want to be known as the guy that created a new weed for Southern Ontario, herbicide-resistant ryegrass. So for all those above reasons and lack of success, I stepped away from an interseeding program and started to play with, or this is what spurred the idea to start playing with using perennial cover crops between my row crop system. And I've been playing, it'll be about 8 years now on a fairly small scale on the farm. This is far from being implemented on large scale. And 4 years ago was made part of the living lab. So getting some testing done and some finding out what's going on below the soil particularly. One of the main reasons I started thinking about this was this little plot I put in, and it's a series of 4 different legumes planted with sunflowers and cereal rye after winter wheat with no fertility added. The first one on the left is a legume called sun hemp, which is a tropical legume with no natural inoculant in my soils. I've found this out afterwards. So essentially a non-functioning legume as far as nitrogen production. Right next to it on the right, I used Austrian winter peas with no added fertility. So there's some shearing going on in the system. The other 2 were faba beans and crimson clover. And I could see a similar effect, but not to the extent of the Austrian winter peas. That started the thought process. And I got thinking about some of the other benefits that potentially would come out of a system like this. And, for my goal of keeping the ground cover year round, it would create a year round ground cover. Nutrient cycling and retention. So the thought is, and these are thoughts that or ideas that I'm trying to tease out of this project to see if it actually does happen. But the thought here is that when the corn is tall or the crop is tall and shading out the perennials, they actually die back a little and release some of the nutrients. When the crop starts to senesce and they get more light and moisture, they start to grow and then start to take in some of that excess fertility that's still available in the soil, so it's not leaving out my tile drainage. Like I said earlier, create some nitrogen, and I'll get into some of the testing I did that in a minute. Also, reducing herbicide usage. In this system, I'm only band spraying directly over my crop rows. So there's the weed control essentially between the rows, the thought is would be the perennials. And it actually does a fairly good job at controlling annual weeds. And I guess you could call that another mode of action of weed control. So it's not a chemical weed control, but I guess a biological weed control. Controlled traffic. All my equipment, other than the combine, it kind of crowds the one row a little bit. All my traffic is on the perennials. So I'm not doing any soil compaction or very little soil compaction in the cropping row because I plant on the same row every year. Creating biological diversity. This is, I know I'm going to create some pests or negative biology that's going to affect the crop, but the thought is that you're also creating an excellent environment for beneficials, and just being larger populations of both, that they would balance themselves out. Starting to see a little bit of evidence of that, but I'm still early days. Although I don't graze, I don't have anything that chews on grass on my farm. I see this as an excellent way of grazing a farm after and before harvest. Normally, if you plan to cover crop after harvest, you would be 6-8 weeks, even after winter wheat, before there would be enough to graze. This way you can almost go in the field behind the combine and start grazing. So the crop rotation that I have for the Living Labs project, I've played with other crops, but just in the Living Labs is a corn, soybean, winter wheat rotation. The corn and soybeans are planted on 30-inch rows. The wheat is set up, I have a drill set up to do twin rows, 5-inch twin rows on 30-inch centers, winter wheat. And the reason I did this is I wanted to keep a cereal in the rotation. I was a little concerned that it was going to be excuse me, a little bit of a yield limiting practice. Not as bad as I had thought. It's about 5% off of my regular production wheat, so it's still producing a decent crop of wheat. Moving forward, I think I'd want to find a different way to do this, but for this Living Labs, this is the procedure. So like I said, I've been at this roughly for 8 years. This was year one. It was in another field. This is July. So one of the early lessons I learned, well, two, when you stand at the end of the field and says, this can't be that hard, you're screwed. You're going to have problems. Don't use modern forage species. They're bred to create biomass. They're bred to have a strong root system. They're bred to scavenge for everything that they need. And this is July. That corn should be over my head. And a couple of friends of mine are looking at the project. And the comment was, oh, it's a nice place to lay down and have a nap. The only thing I harvested that year off that particular field was a nice cut of forage for the neighbor's beef cattle. The other thing I didn't do was terminate a very wide strip for the corn, so it didn't stand a chance even getting out of the ground. I now will terminate almost half the strip, especially for spring seeded crops, to give it a chance to get up, get ahead of it before the perennials creep back in. Like I said earlier, it's really good at controlling annuals, winter annuals, spring annual weeds, both broadleaf and grasses, but it doesn't do a really good job of controlling perennial weeds like perennial sow thistle and Canada thistle. So I have to, one of the things I need to do is figure out how I'm going to manage that in some kind of spray program that will not terminate out the perennials. And the other thing I learned quickly is I need a way to manage the perennials, or at least the ones I'm working with now, so that I can control them until the crop gets large enough. So I looked at or thought about three different mechanisms, one being a herbicide application, herbicide burn or stunting. And there's kind of a fine line between stunting something and killing it. So the goal was not to kill it, and depending on environmental conditions, air temperature, soil moistures, that seemed like a difficult line to walk. I also thought about an in-row roller crimper. I wasn't sure if it was going to be effective enough to do what it did, so I decided on going with, at least for the Living Lab project, a in-row mower, a row mower I call it, and they're 5 10-horse Honda motors with commercial lawnmower blades that will cut the perennial down. I knew I was going to physically reduce the size of that perennial. The reason I went with the Hondas, I thought about hydraulic, I thought about mechanical. Both the mechanical was going to take a lot of engineering, a lot of moving parts. Hydraulic was just, I realized really quick you need the right flow, the right pressure, the right flow dividers, the right displacement on the pumps and speed and reservoir capacity and cooling. It was just going to get really complicated to come up with something that was going to function well. And it's probably has 120 or 30 acres through it already, and it's still, it has made it to the shop a couple of times. The original design was meant to throw the clippings out here and on the other side towards the crop row with the thought of mulching. Didn't work well. In order to get air to move something out, you needed air to get in, and there was no place for air to come in to do that. So that got torched off, put sides on, and now the back was cut out and it's essentially a rear discharge, but essentially still looks like that. But after 3 years of, or one full rotation, corn, soybeans, wheat in a perennial that's been established for over 4 years, I wanted to see if there was any benefit to having that perennial in place. So I just decided to test nitrogen, laid out the plots. I should back up. The light green strips, the long strips, are the perennial strips, and where there's no color is the control. This is a little 6-acre field. The railroad cuts off the corner of my farm, and it doesn't get into things like sugar beets and some of the other production crops. It's a fairly consistent soil type, so it looks a little goofy as a plot, but it was a good place for me to put it. So the plots were laid out in 40 by 40 foot squares of either a perennial with full N, a perennial with 40, a control with full, and a perennial with just 40. So the 40 pounds of N was put down with the planter as a 2 by 2, mostly as 28%. It was just simpler just to leave that turned on than to try to turn that off and on in those spots. I came back later at side dressed another 135 pounds of UAN or 28% on, and just shutting it off in the places that I wanted no extra N. Because they were such small plots, we ended up hand harvesting, and I'd like to thank Laura Bernard. She was one of the people sitting there in my field. She's a researcher with the University of Guelph out of Richtown, and she sent her crew out to help hand harvest 2 4-meter long rows in each plot, and a small sample of total crop biomass. And she put that through her dryer, did all the moisture tests, and weighed it and gave me the yield analysis on those plots. It was too small to try to do through a Yomod or a weight wagon. And drone over the plots. That's a brown silk, so well after tasseling, with no perennials and no side dressed end. It was easy to pick that out. It had turned yellow and was very evident. The perennials with no side dressed end looked as good as everything else, and it's the same spot in the field, looking down between the rows. Really no nitrogen deficit visible where I've had the perennials. So as being a farmer, the first thing I wanted to know was, well, what's the yield differences? And when you look at this, keep in mind those are only 4-meter plots. In the good part of my farm, I don't have a 280 bushel corn crop average at home. And this was an exceptionally good year for corn when we did this. So the control with full N did 292 bushel, with no N was 212, which was amazing enough in itself. 40 pounds of N growing 200 plus bushels. The perennial with full N was 262, and perennials with no N was 256. So in my mind, for 1 year, I would say those were identical yield. Moisture, it did vary. The no N control was by far the driest. Next was full N in the control, and the perennial with no N was a fair bit higher in moisture. I'm thinking it's due maybe to a late release of N out of the perennial that would have been more available earlier in the control side. We also did a plant stand count, and I don't know why, but the perennials have a lower stand count. I'm not sure if it's a pest thing or if it's a maturity thing. The perennial side of the plot tends to be 3 to 4, maybe 5 days later in maturity. So if that's a cooler soil or what's going on, that's didn't pay enough attention to that in this plot. The 50 plants per 8 meters a row works out to about 32, 5 or 6,000, which is my planting rate. The perennials with no N at just over 42 works out to 28,000 and change. So there is a bit of a difference in the amount of viable plants that didn't make it through. I ran all this through because this is kind of what's interesting to me is the difference in what it costs to produce. So the difference, and I took into account a bit more money for band spraying over a boom sprayer, a couple of row mower passes, the reduction in herbicide. I also did an adjustment for the grain moisture itself. And essentially the cost to produce a bushel of corn in the control with full N and the perennial with no N was pretty well the same. So it wasn't costing me more in inputs to and that's without land, to produce the crop. And then I looked at net return on that field. So gross less the input costs, again, less land, about just under $60 less net return on the perennials with no N versus the control with full N. Considering that 7 or 8 years ago, I was sitting in a field of corn up to my knees in perennials in July to this, the gap is narrowing. Some of that may be to the fact that the perennials need to fill that biological tank, whereas the biology is decaying and dying at a fast enough rate that it feeds the perennials, and it's not trying to take it away from the corn. There's potentially some light competition sensing going on, but getting much closer than I was, and it's still a very intriguing project to me. And with that, I wouldn't be me without promoting the Ontario Soil Network, which is an organization based on building networks between farmers who are interested in sustainable soil practices and connecting them across the province so that they get to know each other, can problem solve, bounce ideas off each other, pick up the phone and ask what's going on or what can I do, with the hopes of creating more successes than failures. So with that, this is why I do what I do, or one of the reasons. It's for the future of agriculture, not necessarily for me. So with that, thank you, and I'm thinking we have some time for questions.
Are you having any challenges with insects? It's one thing we've seen in no-till locally, slugs, grubs, cutworms, that sort of thing.
Slugs this year, slugs have been a real challenge. We had an extremely warm, moist, not really wet, but just continuous little rains. And actually the slugs almost terminated my perennial cover crops in the project. They ate my sunflowers, or a good chunk of my sunflowers, twice. So slugs are something that's a bit of a challenge, or can be. Insects, not yet. I think if you were to try this in an organic scenario, it may be a bigger challenge, but I have enough tools that I can use that I seem to be managing them.
Hi, Woody. It's Ryan Barrett here. Question about your underseeding and your interseeding, and you sort of went away from that a bit. What level of interseeding is happening in Ontario, and are there some folks that are having success with it, or is it generally it just doesn't really seem to be working too well? Or you said there was a few species that worked and some that didn't. Maybe you could just shed a little more light on what did work other than annual ryegrass?
Yeah, there's a few guys that are still playing with it. Like I said, ryegrass is one of the best to use, and I'm really trying to steer guys away from it. I know there's some working with red clover and things like that. In production corn, you're seeing less of it. There was never a lot to start with, but the guys are starting to kind of fade away from it. The seed corn production, which is a smaller, thinner stand and things like that, there's still a fair bit of work being done in that system. They just get more light and less competition. I would say it's it's not a growing practice for sure. I think it's slowly dwindling.
Question about your soybean into the winter rye. You said ideally you want 30 pounds of winter rye. And you say you terminate it. How do you terminate it? And when you sow the beans into the rye, do you get them covered with the no-till drill? Because I find if a bean is not covered, it doesn't do too well. And have you ever tried just mowing the rye about a foot high after a week after you plant the beans?
Yeah, I haven't mowed. I can roll or crimp probably 3 times as fast as anything with a mower. So my rye seeding rate, I'll start there, is variable. If I'm seeding in September, it's 20 to 30 pounds. If I'm seeding a late harvested sugar beet crop in the 1st of November, I'm probably 120, 130 pounds, just because it doesn't tiller. So as the fall goes on, my rate goes up, but I would rather err on the side of too thin than too thick. What was the other question? There was one more in there.
How are you said you terminate it. Are you using Roundup how are you terminating?
Yes, I knock it down and you round up, 3/4 of a liter of Roundup, and it turns brown almost within a week. Usually with some of my other residual herbicides at the same time.
And when are you using that Roundup? Before you plant the beans or after you plant the beans?
Now that's a little bit weather dependent. If I'm looking at we're going into a dry couple of weeks and the rye's starting to grow, it'll be Roundup ahead of the planter. If there's any risk at all of a thunderstorm, of a rain event, then it's terminated behind the planter, usually rolled flat and then sprayed. If I'm really concerned that I don't have enough time to manage all my rye at planting time, I will go in April at boot high, 6-8 inches, and terminate it then. And there's enough, the seed end ratio is low enough that it goes away enough that it doesn't become a mulch issue and soil drying.
And when you plant the beans, are you able to make sure you get them covered?
I've had very little trouble with that.
much depth?
It seems to close nicely, both with the drill and a row planter. The other thing I find is that if it is a little bit dry, it doesn't take near as much moisture to regenerate that soil profile than if it was like a full till, open, uncovered field. But yeah, closing, not with cereal rye. I have played with annual ryegrass a little bit years ago, and you would think you had to close and then it turned dry for a couple of days and it would open up like a zipper from one end to the other. That didn't work well. Cereal rye, I haven't had as much problem. And it's partially probably due to my soil types. I'm not sure you have the same success on a really heavy clay.
Have you ever tried spring rye planted in the fall?
No, well, it won't overwinter. So I'm not sure what I would end up with in the spring. I do oats after wheat, so they will actually make head in the fall and die. In that scenario, I make sure it's in a strip till system so that I have a bare strip that's going to dry out, because that oat residue will keep the soil temperatures cooler and wetter.
All right, thank you very much. There's no more questions, I guess. Thank you.
Okay.